Well, thank you for coming out on election night. Oh, we're not in the South. For 21 years, starting when I joined the New York Times, I have been trying to document what is happening to the American economy and the political system's influence on that economy. And I wanted to do this because in 1980, when Ronald Reagan ran for president, I was appalled by the coverage of what Mr. Reagan was proposing to do. There wasn't anything wrong per se with what Mr. Reagan wanted to do, but the reporters covering it did not understand. When Mr. Reagan said, I want the business owners or entrepreneurs to enjoy more of the fruits of their success. And I want to lower tax rates and I want to remove regulations. Now, in my regulation class at Syracuse, I start off by pointing out to my students that everything is regulated. Everything. Always has been. Baseball regulates how many stitches are on the ball. I mean, baseball's fine, but it's trivial, and yet it has very finely diced rules. Syracuse University regulates dating. That's what a sexual harassment policy is. It's a way of regulating dating. This building was built subject to regulations on building codes so that we're safe being here. We're not worried it's going to collapse. Everything is regulated. That doesn't mean we have good or bad regulation. And I try to teach my students about regulation which will be virtuous because it is self-reinforcing of virtuous behavior. And I also show them examples and get them to think about areas of regulation that are vicious, that encourage misconduct. And we've adopted an enormous number of those in the last 30 years in this country, where you are rewarded for looking the other way and punished if you speak up in business. So when I arrived at the New York Times, I came with a very simple view of something. That if you understand the economics of something, and I had spent a great deal of my life studying economics, writing about them. I went to the Chicago School for two quarters as a fellow. And if you understand the regulations, you can tell broadly where any industry is going to go. You don't know exactly what's going to happen, because you don't know who's going to get promoted, fired, what new product is going to come along, but you know where things must go. It's no different than when you're a child and someone pours water to show you it has to go downhill, and if there's a groove, it will follow that groove because it's the path of least resistance. And the New York Times immediately began getting letters from people and phone calls saying, who is this guy? He doesn't know what he's doing. There's no growing inequality in America. This just isn't true. And one of the editors at the Times was so worried about this, he came to my desk one day and said, well, what about this specific complaint about a number? And I said, come here, let me show you something. And I said, okay, what? And I opened up a spreadsheet in my computer. And he said, yeah. And I said, watch these. These are called tabs. And he said, well, what are those? I said, I tested the numbers every way I could to make sure that what we were telling people was accurate and reliable. So let me tell you today what the official data of the United States government says. The average income of the bottom 90% of Americans in 2013, the most recent year we have data for, 2013, was essentially the same after you adjust for inflation as 1967 when I graduated from Knight High School. 1967. We've gone nowhere. It's up $322 to $33,000. Now, first of all, notice that 90% of Americans have an average income of about $600 a week. That covers people from zero up to the threshold to get into the top 10%, which is a little over $100,000. But it's heavily weighted to the bottom end of this. I live in Rochester, New York. I've lived there for 22 years. In the 1960s, Rochester, New York was the wealthiest city in America. Business Week magazine did a big cover story about how wealthy Rochester was because of the Xerox 941 machine. Come on up front, there's seats up here. The Xerox 941 machine and Kodak with its monopoly color film and a whole host of other industries. Today, if you live in Rochester, statistically, every sixth person that you meet lives below half the official poverty level. They live in extreme poverty. Below half. We didn't have homeless people when I was a kid. When I was a kid, growing up in California, once in a while, there were alcoholics, there were men who had ruined their lives with alcohol on a Skid Row. And once in a while, you'd meet a family that they'd lost their home and things were going badly, but you didn't have families in enduring situations of not being able to get a home. You don't worry about getting a job. I never thought once about how do I get a job in the late 60s. If all I needed was a job, they were all around. They were available. Not today. Students are all worried. How am I going to work? How am I going to make a living? What's going to happen to me? What am I going to do? Because we've changed our economy. Now, let me give you an idea of the scale of this. Because of a statistical fluke, we know how much the 400 highest tax returns in America were in 1961. It's actually the 398. And the government's been doing a report for the last 23 years on the 400 highest tax returns. Now, these are not the people with the biggest incomes. Lots and lots of people, and I'll talk about this shortly, don't have to report their income. But the highest tax returns. In 1961, those people in the top 400 paid 42% of their income in federal income taxes. In 2011, they paid less than 17%, 16.6%. And by the way, their average income was in round numbers $1 million a day. $1 million a day. What happened to the 90%, the vast majority of Americans over the same period? Well, their taxes went down just as the super rich went down. The super rich got a 60% reduction in their tax burden. And I'm talking about income taxes and payroll taxes, Social Security and Medicare taxes. Top group, 60% reduction. The bottom 90%, well, they got a 20% reduction in their income taxes, but it was completely taken back with higher payroll taxes. So they're paying the same tax burden. And their income at the end of this period was the equivalent of getting a raise of a nickel an hour, a nickel a week a year. Nothing. They went almost nowhere in terms of income growth. Here's another way to think about it. In 2013, the increase in income for the top 16,000 households in America, now that's the 1% of the 1%, compared to 1967. Remember I told you that the bottom 90% went up 1%, $300 a year after all those years to $33,000. The 1% of the 1%, their incomes went up $25 million per household. And to give you an idea of the scale, let's take that $322 increase and imagine it's 1 inch. So how did the people at the top do if we did this as a chart in a newspaper or a magazine? Well, their line would rise up above my feet, above my head, above the roof of this building, 1.1 miles to 1 inch. Now, what brought this about? You'll hear politicians tell you, well, it's education. It's education that did it. Think about the society around you and ask yourself, does that sort of make sense to you? No. Well, it's globalization. Well, there's some truth in that. Imagine if you had grown up in a town somewhere in America and there was one bank in town and Daddy owned it. And then as you got to be a little older, Daddy owned the biggest bank in the county, and then the biggest bank in the state. And you took it over and made it the biggest bank in America, and your child turned it into the biggest bank in the world. You'd be pretty rich. So there is an element of that, of scale. But by the way, as banks have gotten bigger, that means there are fewer banks and less competition. And that means there's fewer jobs. We have about 7,000 banks in America today. 35 years ago, we had 15,000. When you see all these mergers going on, they destroy jobs. Competition requires jobs. Lack of competition doesn't require jobs. It means fewer and fewer jobs, especially well-paid jobs. But that's not where the real growth is going on. The real growth is going on in a couple of key areas. One of them is the remarkable sums that we are paying to the very top executives, the CEOs of big American companies. In 1996, I was the principal reporter on what is to date, and I presume therefore forever, will be the biggest enterprise project the New York Times ever undertook. And it was about taxes and avoidance of taxes. And we showed how, well, I'll tell you the lead the New York Times didn't run on the story. This is 1996. 5 years ago, you may recall reading in this newspaper that the chairman of the Coca-Cola Company was paid $98 million for 1 year's work. Here is what you didn't read. Roberto Goizueta, the head of Coke, paid taxes on only $2 million of that money. On the other $96 million, he can delay paying those taxes so long as he works running Coca-Cola, which could be many years into the future. And Mr. Goizueta is not alone. John F. Welch, the head of GE, Lawrence Bossidy at Allied Signal, John Akers at IBM, all have the same deals. They just aren't paid as much money. Corporate America set up these plans where you earn today and you get paid in the distant future. General Electric, probably in response to my reporting about the pay of Jeff Immelt, the CEO now, a couple of years ago, said that it was misleading to use the numbers required by the Securities and Exchange Commission that are in the newspapers to say that Mr. Immelt was paid $32 million last year. His W-2 statement, you know, the one you all get to do your tax return, only showed about $8 million. But think about that. What that means is that the majority of his pay wasn't reported as being taxable. It was deferred into the future. Donald Trump. I'm the person who revealed in 1990 when I was at the Philadelphia Inquirer that, well, Mr. Trump said he had a $3 billion net worth, but he couldn't pay his bills. He had a negative net worth because I got a hold of his personal financial statement. Mr. Trump is the beneficiary of a rule passed by Congress in the 1990s that says that if you are a full-time real estate professional, and it defines full-time as 15 hours a week, you may take unlimited paper losses, depreciation on your buildings, to offset against your income. Now, almost all Americans are limited to $25,000 they can deduct against their salaries if they're little landlords. That's all they can take, $25,000. If you make $200,000 a year or more, you can't deduct anything. And if you're under the alternative minimum tax, as I suspect many of you are, and if you're not, those of you with children who live in this state or New York, they almost certainly are, you're not allowed any deductions for that. But if you're a full-time real estate professional like Mr. Trump, if you own enough real estate to turn your salary and business profit income to zero, you just need one, you actually don't have to go to zero, you only have to go to $18,849. You don't pay income taxes. So, you know, Mr. Trump claimed a few years ago that he was being paid $65 million a year for The Apprentice. Now, NBC said that's ridiculous, put out a statement about it. But let's assume it's true for the moment. Donald Trump actually told the truth. In 2011, the tax on $65 million of pay would have been almost $23 million. In fact, if that's what he was paid, Mr. Trump will get richer off of the tax system than he will from GE. Because if he can offset that income and report zero income to the federal government, that $23 million is converted from a burden, the burden we all bear, into a benefit. He gets to keep the $23 million he would have given to the government and invest it. And Mr. Trump says that he's a world-class investor, right? So let's assume he earns 10% on his money for 20 years. That's the normal period of a real estate deal, 20 years. At the end of the 20-year period, he could pay that $23 million tax and put $130 million in his pocket. The magic, you know, Sir Isaac Newton and before him the alchemists of the medieval era, they all tried to find the philosopher's stone that would turn lead into gold. Well, Congress found it. They created it. You just turn red ink black or black ink red. It's amazing how much money you can make doing this. And by the way, it's not limited just to real estate developers. If you're a private equity manager, Mitt Romney, whose tax returns, remember, he would only give us 2 years. And I kept writing pieces at the time. I was the worldwide economics columnist for Reuters, saying, you know, we need to see the tax returns from the years that you ran Bain Capital. And by the way, many of you probably don't know this because I think Reuters was alone in reporting this, but Mitt Romney didn't just run Bain Capital, he was the 100% owner of Bain Capital. Well, private equity managers and hedge fund managers are allowed to defer the majority of their income back into their funds. And so long as they keep the fund going, there's no tax. So when you hear in the press about carried interest, 15%, oh, these guys, they only have to pay, it's now 20% tax. They don't have to pay it for labor income, that would be 40%. They only have to pay the lower rate for capital gains. That's awful. Boy, I gotta tell you, the tax lawyers on Wall Street are going, yay, the press got it wrong. Because it's not the tax rate that matters, it's the time value of the money. That's what's fantastic, is that you don't have to pay the tax until so far in the future that you can pay the tax with the earnings on your fund and have more money in your pocket. I mean, it is a situation in which, quite literally, you get to eat your cake and have a whole cake. Corporations get a very similar deal. In 1986, we passed the Tax Reform Act. The Tax Reform Act generally was, by the way, pretty good law. It's been completely made useless at this point. I am in the process of drafting an entirely new proposed federal tax code. The U.S. government tax code is 6,500 pages, so I guess about this thick. Mine will be about this thick when I get it done. But in 1986, when the Tax Reform Act was passed, there was one line put in there that nobody paid attention to in Section 531. And what it said was, it undid a law that Congress had passed in 1909 and had re-upped in various forms ever since. The corporate income tax in America began before the individual income tax. It started in 1909. And when the corporate income tax was begun, the debates in Congress were about the following problem. Well, if you have a company and it makes a big, huge profit, how do you make sure they put the money back into the economy? They reinvest to grow the business, or they pay better wages, or they pay dividends, or they pay bonuses to the executives. Because think about it, if corporations took all their profits, turned them into dollar bills, stuffed them in the equivalent of a mattress, the economy would sink, it wouldn't grow. So we had something called the earnings test. And if you had too much cash in your business, the IRS came after you, and Congress said you impose a penalty tax, which has ranged over the years from 15 to 20%. So right now, it's a 20% tax, and that means that if you were dinged with this, if you're a domestic company, like the little company I founded here in New Jersey with 25 workers with one of my sons, you would have the 35% corporate income tax to pay, and then you pay the penalty on top. Tens of thousands of little American businesses have been hit with this penalty over the years. The famous case is a guy who got real lucky when he was young. He met Ray Kroc, and he got some early in Connecticut McDonald's franchises, and soon he's got money running out his ears, and he's just leaving it in the company. The IRS comes along and says, nope, sorry, you got to do something with it. You can't retain all that cash. Well, this exemption said, unless you put it overseas. That's not literally what the words say, but that's what they mean. And it was right after that you began seeing all these subsidiary companies. You began all this stuff. And I'm the guy who first wrote about this. The first place it was written about in any serious way was in the New York Times, a long time ago. And I showed that Enron didn't pay taxes as a result of this. And what you do is you take profits you earn in America and you convert them into expenses. So if you have Nike shoes, every time you buy a Nike shoe for $150 for a pair of shoes, there's a fee, and let's assume it's just $1, that Nike pays for the swoosh symbol on the shoe. Nike pays that dollar to Nike Swoosh Inc., or whatever it's called, in the Cayman Islands or Bermuda or Barbados or Singapore, depending on their particular deal. And what they've effectively done is taken money out of their right pocket, here in America, in their case in Oregon, and put it into their offshore pocket, and they get a deduction for it. They have converted a profit into a tax-deductible expense. The most famous example of this, the one I wrote about in my book, Perfectly Legal, is Pfizer. Now, some years ago in this country, we had a disease that had been extremely rare suddenly became less rare, called pulmonary hypertension, and it was always fatal. And a doctor in Rochester, New York, a doctor of pharmacology, whose house I rented, by the way, for the first 5 years I lived in Rochester, New York, invented this drug combination to help people lose weight called the fen-phen diet. Well, some of the people on the fen-phen diet developed pulmonary hypertension. Pfizer was working on a drug to address pulmonary hypertension. And the way you address it is you relax the blood vessels and you let them flow lots of blood in. And as scientists are prone to do, they experimented with their own product before it was licensed. And the guys, especially the senior researchers, noticed it had a very interesting effect. So they took the formula, not yet licensed for sale, and therefore not worth much. And they sold it to a Swiss subsidiary, which licensed it to a Liechtenstein entity that in the tax world is known as a tax nothing because it's invisible to the IRS in an audit. Then they finished working on this drug, developing it, and pretty soon Pfizer is making a fortune off Viagra. $18 a pill is the current average price, and the marginal cost of manufacture, they won't tell us, but if it's more than a dime, I'll be flabbergasted. And the profits all go out of the country as tax-deductible expenses. Well, this drug was so successful, along with a couple of others, that Pfizer had this terrible problem. They had all these untaxed profits offshore that made them look like they were really going gangbusters as a business. Well, meanwhile, they're reporting to their shareholders these terrible tax burdens because when the companies report their taxes, they don't report the deferral. They say, oh, 35% of the profits, that's our tax. They don't say 35% of the profits we haven't taken out of the country. And so they got Congress to adopt the law, the 2004 American Jobs Creation Act. Senator Mike Ensign of Nevada got up, I think he was the one of the Nevada senators got up, yeah, it had to be Ensign, and said, 660,000 jobs will be created if we just pass this law and let these companies bring this money back and only pay a 5.25% tax instead of 35%. And it's really unfair, all these profits that were earned offshore, they've already been taxed. They shouldn't be taxed again. Well, first of all, if you earn money from real business offshore, you get a dollar for dollar credit. You pay $1 to the Saudis, you get $1 off your US tax. You pay $1 to the Germans, you get $1 off your US tax. So that's nonsense. There's some complicated rules about it, but it's a dollar for dollar offset, basically. Congress passed the law literally the day after Pfizer got its money into the country and saved $11 billion. They started firing people. And they went on firing people until Pfizer had fired 40,000 people. That is, it was the American Jobs Destruction Act. They kept those people on the payroll until they got the deal. And by the way, what's being pushed in Washington, and I'm told by progressive members of Congress, is going to happen? We're going to have another Jobs Creation Act, only they're not going to be dumb enough this time to call it that. They're going to call it the American Repatriation Act. Now, how does this affect inequality and poverty? Well, 90% of the public is still paying the same tax burden they used to pay. And other people are getting rich off taxes. They are literally turning a profit off taxes. And by the way, when I reported that Enron didn't pay taxes, I told the editors of the New York Times that I'm absolutely certain that they talk about it inside the company as a profit center. Couldn't prove it, so we couldn't put it in the paper. My work resulted in the Congressional Joint Committee on Taxation staff undertaking the biggest investigation they've ever done. They published a 3-volume, 1,800-page report brought about by my work. And they had subpoena power. And so they subpoenaed documents. And if you will look at the report, it's in any big federal depository library, it's on the website electronically, you will see that, lo and behold, the tax department at Enron was known as a profit center. We have turned taxes for select groups of people into a source of profit. America has 2 tax systems, separate and unequal. One for a select group of people favored by Congress who profit off taxes, and one for everybody else who is burdened by them. And when you do these deals, by the way, you're subsidizing those people. You're being taxed to make them rich. Here's how that works. Pfizer sends $1 billion offshore that the tax hasn't been paid. If you're a conservatively managed company, you're not going to risk losing that in the stock market. In many cases, you're not going to invest it in more business because there's not enough demand. There's no what economists call aggregate demand. People can't buy more goods and services because they don't have any more money. So what you do is you buy U.S. Treasury notes. You buy debt. You're taxed to pay the interest on the federal debt the government sold because it didn't collect the money from Pfizer. And so you're taxed to make Pfizer richer for delaying paying the taxes when your taxes come out of your paycheck before you get it. Now, that's not the only factor at work here. There are a whole bunch of other factors that are at work. In this book, Divided, which was a labor of love, I didn't make, on a per hour basis, I made less than minimum wage on this book. There are 44 contributors to this book. President Obama, Elizabeth Warren, Joe Stiglitz, Paul Krugman, all the big players. I mean, I had people literally calling me saying, I want to be in this book. And not that it sold like I would like. But in this book, I saw to it that we examined all the dimensions of poverty. So one of them is what we've seen in Flint. There's a chapter in there about, or 2 chapters, I think, about inequality of hazard. Inequality of hazard of environmental conditions. And that's come very much home to us by what's happened in Flint and the unbelievable non-response of the governor of that state, whose Twitter handle, by the way, is One Tough Nerd, and who won't release his emails and is trying to strengthen the law that will shield. He's released emails from a certain period. He won't release them from the period that I, as an investigative journalist, really want to see. And he's trying to get the law strengthened so that he doesn't have to release them, which tells you there's something they're trying to hide. Think about where we put toxic dumps, where we build poor people's housing. That's one form of inequality. Another one we all know about is education. Roughly 15% of American children get fabulous public educations, and 85% get much less. Where I live in Rochester, New York, the Rochester City School District a couple of years ago had a graduation rate for black males at the end of 4 years of high school of 9%. If you included GEDs, general education certificates, general education diplomas, thank you, GEDs, and people who went to fifth year, and people who took a lesser state test, they got the black male graduation rate up to 43%. But arguably, Rochester, New York has what could be the worst public school system in America, right up there with Camden, for example. Almost touching the district, at one corner, is another school district that is one of the highest performing school districts in America. This is a story of divide. This is a story of lack of access to jobs. We used to have lots of urban factory jobs. When I was a boy in California, I remember my father taking me into San Francisco, and there were it smelled early in the morning. My father was a chef of coffee, because there were these big coffee roasters right down at the end of Market Street. The buildings are still there, the signs are still there, they just don't do coffee there anymore. And there were factories in the city. And there were lots of blue-collar jobs. The same thing was true in Brooklyn and in Manhattan. The UN is built on what used to be a slaughterhouse and a meatpacking plant. All those jobs got moved out to the suburbs, and many of them were moved out with your tax dollars. Grants were made. Facilities were provided. So sometimes they wouldn't write a company a check, but they'd say, you know what? If you'll move to this place, we'll build the road, we'll put in the water supply, we'll upgrade our sewers, just move your factory here. And moved all these jobs out into the countryside. Subsidies to American corporations by state and local governments, not Washington. City councils, counties, industrial development agencies, state governments are now running around $80 billion a year. They were $70 billion a year in 2010, and they've gone up since then. So they're certainly above 80 now. How much money is that? Well, if you're a family of four, it's $900 a year. And you know what the average gross pay for a family of four is in America, wages? It's about $950 a week. People are working for a week to give money to companies. And the worst part of this is the companies that are getting these subsidies, they're in the economic chain at the wrong end. If you're going to subsidize a business, well, let's see. Economics starts with mining, right? You take rocks out of the ground, you shoot them full of electricity, and you get aluminum. You take rocks out of the ground, you crush them, you run them through a bunch of chemicals, you melt them, you get steel, iron, which you can turn into steel. Then you manufacture things. You stamp the aluminum or the steel into automobiles and airplanes and all sorts of stuff. The subsidies increasingly are going to retail, which is the very end of the economic chain. You cannot grow an economy with retail. The only way retail sales of any operation can grow are either more people, or they have more income, or a combination of those two. So when the government gives money to Walmart, and a newspaper says Walmart will have 250 jobs at their new supercenter, they're destroying about 300 jobs at other small businesses around there. And by the way, 90% of Walmart distribution centers, 89%, are built partly with your tax dollars. Lowe's, Home Depot, Staples, all these companies are in the deal, and here's how it works. Walmart comes to town, or Lowe's, or one of these companies and says, we want to put something there in that corner. And we had an agent who doesn't know who we are, and we sent him to go talk to Joe Smith, and Joe Smith said, I'm not selling you that piece of land. You know, I don't care it's a bare piece of land. I'm not selling it. So we want you to use the power of eminent domain to seize the land from him. Now, the Constitution says he gets just compensation, and I'll tell you what the economic analysis of the actual payments is. It stands for far more deeply discounted than anything Walmart ever sold. Then the government clears the land, builds the building as directed by Walmart, and leases it to Walmart. It's now tax exempt. It's owned by government. So your property tax bill, you want to know why it's getting tougher? Then you go to the store. You stop going to what's your name? You stop going to Tom's retail store because it's just not as convenient and as cheap as Walmart. And you go over to Walmart, and when you get the cash register and they ring it up and they say, here's the sales tax, Walmart gets to keep the sales tax. It doesn't go to the schools or the fire department or the police department. Walmart keeps the sales tax. And it pays it to the government agency so that it can repay the bonds, the tax-free municipal bonds they sold, to pay the cost of buying land and building the store. When the bonds are paid off, now the government begins to get the money again. The schools get the money, the police and the fire department get the money. But that means the Walmart store was built with your tax dollars, not with their capital. That's not capitalism. That is, in fact, the very definition of communism, except for ownership. There's no ownership. On Lake Canandaigua, about a half-hour drive from my home, there was a proposal to build a big hotel, which they're going ahead with, and a restaurant and other things. And per se, I don't have any problem with that. I mean, there's environmental concerns about, is it too much human density on the lake? But we can deal with those issues. But I got called by the local paper down there, and they said, well, they want the local city government to put up 10% of the money. And I said, oh, well, does the city government get 10% of the ownership? Well, no, it's an incentive to get them to build. I said, no, wait a minute. If you put up 10% of the money, you get a 10% ownership stake. And they said, no, they want the city council to give them the money. I said, oh, they want welfare. And there's a phrase I use about these deals. If it's a sound investment, the market will finance it. If it's not a sound investment, why should you be taxed to make it happen? That doesn't make any sense. Now, here's the problem with this. How many of you know the stuff that I just told you? As you took a class where they used one of my books to teach, so few of you know some of this, okay? You may have read my books, you may have heard what some other journalists have done because of my work, but overall, this isn't in the news. And when it does appear in the news, it's presented as a benefit. We're getting a new Lowe's thanks to the magic of tax increment financing, which is the system I just described to you using eminent domain in the bonds. People don't understand what's happening because they're not being told. And I will tell you, I've had audiences where I've had people say, that's just too complicated to understand. And I say, fine, I'll make it simple for you. You're paying taxes to make the guys who own the company rich. Well, are they creating jobs? They say they're creating jobs. I think they're actually destroying jobs at other locations. But they're creating jobs. Okay, well, that's all right. That's not capitalism. That's not market economics. And that's why we're in trouble. We are not paying attention to the fundamental basics of market economics. And so there are these other ramifications that arise now. Because government has put this money into moving these places out of the city, at the same time, governments keep saying we can't afford our transit systems. We've got to cut bus routes. So in Buffalo, one of the most poor and troubled cities in America, although, 100 years ago, Buffalo was just ripping 2 million people. A company came to town and said, we're going to create hundreds of jobs with a call center. But we need this subsidy for the call center. Where people call from a company and they say, my toaster oven doesn't work, I don't understand it, or whatever. So they set this thing up as a job creation program to address inner city poverty. And then they built it in the whitest suburb of Buffalo, which has essentially no effective bus service to get there. And the workforce, at least based on watching people go in and out of the parking lot, is about as white as this room. Government policy is creating the inequality we have in America. Government policy is allowing people in certain positions to mine your wallet, to drain money out of your wallet in subtle ways and get rich while impoverishing you. I want us to be rich. I want us to prosper. Harvey Cox, the theologian who teaches at Harvard, has had me in twice to speak at his classes. And the first time I went, we went to dinner, and I said to Harvey, I was ranting on about the ministers on TV. God wants you to be rich. Send me money, right? And I said, that's just really appalling. And Harvey called me up short. He said, David, every religious text in the world, God wants you to prosper and maybe be rich. That's not the problem. The problem with those guys is they just teach one side of the message. They don't talk about the widow's mite. They don't talk about your obligation to pay fair wages and to pay the laborer properly. They don't talk about the Old Testament rule that if you were a lender and the security was the cloak, the sleeping cloak of the person, that even if they couldn't pay you back at the end of the day, you had to give them back their cloak because otherwise people would freeze to death. Teaching a one-sided lesson. Now there's a related development to this about the founders of this country. The founders of this country were very big on equality and education and opportunity. They wanted to have every man be a capitalist, in effect. They wanted farmers to own their land and workers to own their tools. Now, it's not practical today for everybody to farm, and there isn't enough land for all of us to be farmers, even if that's what you wanted to do. It's not what I want to do. But the principle was very clear. They did not want people to be what we today call wage slaves. They wrote about this at length. They wrote about their concern that if workers only had wages and no property, they wouldn't understand property, and a business aristocracy would arise that would trick these people and persuade them that what was good for the business aristocrats was good for these wage slaves, when in fact it was terrible for them, which is, by the way, what I see going on right now in America. People with no property, who don't have any sense of property, behave differently. So in 1792, Congress was presented with a problem. About 80% of the US government's budget was to pay the federal debt. A lot worse than today, by the way. And the British were harassing American cod fishing ships on the North Banks. A quarter of our foreign earnings came from selling cod to Europe. And so the industry came to Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, and said, we need a subsidy. Jefferson, being a man of science, unlike the House Science Committee, ordered a study. And he then made a recommendation to Congress, which passed it like this. And the recommendation was this. There are two kinds of fishing ships, those that pay wages and those that pay the fishermen and sailors a share of the profits. Only those that pay a share of the profits will participate in this program. Sailors will get 62.5% of the money, and the owners will get the other, the minority share, the 3/8 of it, so 5/8 and 3/8. And there has to be a signed agreement between all of the fishermen and the owners of the boat before it sets sail. Kind of sound like collective bargaining in a union? And it worked. It was very successful. Subsidies per se aren't bad, but the subsidies we're doing now, why does Walmart need a subsidy? Yeah. And by the way, that's without discussing the fact that Walmart collects about $6.8 billion a year in subsidies indirectly because so many of its workers get food stamps, Medicaid, and other things. Now, there's an argument you've heard repeatedly, we can't afford the minimum wage. I mean, this will drive businesses out of business. Well, okay, let's just follow that argument to its logical conclusion. In the ancient world, if you couldn't pay your debts, you could sell yourself into slavery. Lo and behold, a survey found last week that 20% of the people who support Mr. Trump in South Carolina believe it was a mistake to free the slaves. So what I used to make as a joke is like a little scarier than you would imagine. There are a lot of people who think that.
In fairness, they said they didn't support Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation. how many of them actually know what the emancipation?
All right, I'll accept that. That's a reasonable. I agree with you. I'll accept that that's a reasonable point. They may not have understood that it meant freeing the slaves. I find that you got to work pretty hard to not know that, but okay. So the inequality didn't just happen. You know, we have these textbooks that they talk about things in the past like slavery, and they sort of just somehow they happened. Inequality, Joe Stiglitz's quote, one of the quotes from Joe Stiglitz in my book, inequality didn't just happen, it was created. It is the policy of the Congress of the United States of America to keep a number of people in poverty and to tax them to benefit the very richest people in this country. People who are in the upper middle class think, boy, I'm really paying a lot of taxes, and you are. People above me must really be burdened. No. Once you get up to $2 million of income, tax rates level off, and when you get to $8 million, they start to fall. And when you get far enough up, they go away. Because if you have one of these deferral accounts, like Mr. Trump and the hedge fund managers, or if you just have a huge fortune, you know, you got a letter last week, Uncle Harry you never heard of left you $1 billion, you don't have to pay taxes again. If you make 5% a year, your fortune will grow by $50 million the first year, right? So you borrow $10 million, that's a pretty good lifestyle. The interest on that will cost you about $200,000 at current rates. And at the end of the year, you're worth $40 million more than you were at the beginning of the year. You pay no taxes and get richer and richer. Because we don't regard that kind of borrowing as income. And so our government our infrastructure falls apart. Our economy becomes less efficient. We have deaths because of cars that hit potholes and guardrails that aren't safe. We have lead water. And we're all told, well, we just can't afford these things. We can't afford. I was on with a congressman on a radio show one day who said, we can't afford to fix up our roads. And I said, well, fine, Congressman, what are you going to do when you can't move goods anymore? You can't ship automobiles from the factory, and you can't move oranges from California to your state. And he didn't have any answer to that. He hadn't thought about it. He was just spouting what he'd been told. Now, the rules of our economy, we can set up any way we want. This is to remind me, and it's about to go off, and I'm going to cancel it to wind up. We can organize our economy any way we want. And what we're doing now is what I understood Mr. Reagan was doing. We are saying to the owners of businesses, have a good life today, don't invest in the future. Imagine for a moment that you're a very wealthy business owner. You're really rich. And one day your spouse comes home, man or woman, and says, they got this painting, it's going up at Sotheby's called Modigliani Nude 1917. It's going to cost $85 million. I've got to have it. If I don't have it, your life is going to be miserable. And you got plenty of money in the company, take it out of the company and buy it. Well, if the tax rate is what it is today, or what it was at the time I first did this, during the Bush years, 15%. You pull $100 million out of the company, you pay the 15% tax, you get $85 million left, you get the painting. You paid a little premium for it. That's not a bad deal, though. You pretty much converted dollars into oil painting. But what if the corporate tax rate's 50%? Now you can take $170 million out to get the painting. You're not going to do it. You're not going to own a personal 747. Sheldon Adelson has two, one equipped for skateboarding in the sky by his youngest heirs. You're not going to own more mansions than John McCain could remember, or homes anyway. You're going to live a much more modest lifestyle because the tax rates are so high. And when a decision is made to withdraw capital from a business, that is, in economic terms, a decision to destroy jobs. More and more capital is needed to support jobs. So when you withdraw more than necessary to sustain your lifestyle, you are, in economic terms, over time, overall, destroying jobs. If you had a 50% tax rate and a 15% tax rate, And at the end of the year, the finance guy walks in the day after Christmas and says, hey, I got a delayed present for you. We're going to make $10 million more profit than they thought. Well, in the first case, you say, that's great. I'm going to take $8.5 million out of the company. But in the other case, you're going to say to yourself, well, boy, I don't want to give the government $5 million to get $5 million. Why don't we sign contracts this week? Let's fix up production line number 2. Let's fix the roof on the factory. Let's give bonuses to our better salespeople. That's because the government will be paying 50 cents on the dollar for it. These low tax rates are a core problem that people don't understand. Now, people tell me all the time, and some of you may have questions, and I'm going to take questions after this, and I want you to ask a question. Don't give me a speech. I'll cut you off if you do, and we'll go to somebody else and come back to you. They say, well, we can't do anything about it. They're too powerful. Well, if you say that, you're saying the only thing I know of that's actually un-American. We founded this country on the idea that we will solve our own problems, not some monarch across the North Atlantic. We founded this country in the idea that we will take responsibility for our future. And what people are really saying is, either of us don't want to do the work. We can solve any problem we have. Our Constitution enshrined the ownership of human beings. We got rid of it. 750,000 people, 40,000 of them black Americans, died. But we got rid of slavery. We haven't gotten rid of all the residue of the original sin of our civic life, but we got rid of slavery. There was a time more than 100 years ago when the Jerry Falwells and Pat Robertsons of the day were running around saying, of those seeking child labor laws, it is God's plan that these children work in the factories, and those of you who favor these laws are the agents of the devil. Well, we got child labor laws. We got Pure Meat Act laws, Pure Food Act laws. We got union organizing rights, although those are being rapidly written away to nothing. We got really good environmental laws signed into law by Richard Nixon. If he came back today, would be dismissed by the Republicans as being Dennis Kucinich. But we can't solve our problems if we say we can't do anything about it. It's not easy. It doesn't happen in a hurry. Frederick Douglass spent his whole life seeking real equality for black Americans. Susan B. Anthony's reputed last words after 80 years of struggle were, "It is inevitable." But she didn't live to see it happen. Now, I think we're at a point where we have to make a simple choice. And the Republicans, to their credit, by the way, I'm a registered Republican, the Republicans have put it right in front of us. They don't say it in the words I'm about to put it in, but when I tell you what they say, when I synthesize it, I think you'll recognize their message. And by the way, unlike the Democrats, who can't figure out quite what's wrong, they have a solution too, the Republicans. What the Republicans are saying is the reason you don't have jobs, the reason we don't have a robust economy, is the rich don't have enough to invest. They need more. They don't have enough. And they have a plan to get it to them. They're going to take it from the poor, from the sick, from the elderly, from the disabled, and from children. They're going to cut entitlements. Now, why being disabled and a flow of money is an entitlement, but Donald Trump's loans from the government, Pfizer's offshore loans from the government at zero interest aren't entitlements, I don't understand. They're the same thing in economic terms. So, whining and moaning and posting things on social media accomplishes this much. Nothing. But informing people, talking to them, not saying you're an idiot and don't know what you're talking about, but listening to their fears and concerns and showing them that things can be different. Getting people to register to vote, getting people to the polls, picking an issue, whatever that issue is, because you can't work on everything, and working with other people to change things and show people there's a better way. That's how we bring change about. Change in America comes from the bottom down, at least all the good change I've identified in all my studies over the years. And the only change that's really bad comes when people near the bottom don't understand, just as the founders warned, about economic issues. And they are tricked by the business aristocracy into voting for things that they're told are good for them, but are actually toxic. So thank you.